Hi, everyone. I want to talk about a interesting topic in the blockchain space that is quite unfamiliar to people who aren't in the space. And so for some, this will be a little bit remedial, but hopefully still interesting. And for some, it should actually orient you on how blockchains work, because it's quite different than our experience with, say, the banking system. And that topic is human meaningful identities. So I'll get into what that means very quickly. This one will be shorter than some of the last videos. We'll kind of try out that length and see what people like. So cryptocurrencies are pseudonymous. Um, I'll go into what that means shortly, but transactions tend not to be. So, I'm at the grocery store. I know who the corporate brand of the grocery store is. I know the brand of what I'm buying, kind of, et cetera. It's actually quite rare where the seller of something, you know, is not known to the buyer. Maybe one situation where it would be is something like an exchange setting where, suppose I'm looking to acquire some Apple stock. Someone on the other side is looking to sell some Apple stock, and the exchange matches us, and we don't learn each other's identities. That said, I know the identity of the exchange, so it's not even a great example. So this modality of operation can be unfamiliar to people. So going into what pseudonymous actually means. So this is just a screen cap from Etherscan, one of the popular Ethereum blockchain explorers. You can see that there's from in this sort of hexadecimal string, AF0, etc., to E35, etc. There's a quantity denominated in ETH on the right-hand side. And so to the outside observer, you wouldn't know who these people are, or some of them, might in fact be smart contracts themselves, which I can go into detail on at some other time. So it might be a human-to-human transaction. It might be a human-to-smart contract transaction. It's not quite clear at this time. And this is all, so the blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, is a whole bunch of transactions like this. And so it's hard to get kind of interpretability, who these people are, what good or service was exchanged, what's the meaning of this transaction, and we're focusing on like who the people are for this video. So the lesson is you can't always get a human or a business or even a smart contract, human label, if you will, associated with that alphanumeric address. You can see the transactions. So in most cases on blockchains, with some exceptions, with some of the new tech that's coming out, you can see all of the transactions and all of the details. They're just not necessarily identifiable down to a human, business, or an obvious human understandable label, so to speak. So I think for this reason, some people call blockchains pseudonymous instead of anonymous. So sometimes you do know. Back in the day, there was a service called Local Bitcoins, which I don't think is still running, or if it is, it's not as popular, where you would actually meet people physically. I never actually did this, but I knew people who did. And you would exchange, let's say, dollars on one hand for Bitcoin on the other hand. So in that case, you would actually see the person you're transacting with. You would sort of type things in, kind of watch the confirmations go through on a blockchain explorer to let you know that the transaction on the blockchain side has actually happened. And then as that occurs, you sort of pretty much simultaneously, would give the person the US dollars for the Bitcoin. So similarly, you can kind of do it on the internet. If you're making an internet-based purchase, the party that you're making the purchase with will tell you an address to send the funds to. You might not know, that the represented, identity on the internet is, real somehow in a physical sense, but at least, kind of some vendor said that there's, this address, and if you send, some amount of currency to it, you'll get something back, basically. And there are popular addresses. So at some of the exchanges, on-chain market makers, that sort of thing, staking addresses, etc., get so much transactive activity that it's kind of hard to hide their purpose, and sometimes there's no intent to hide their purpose. So just as an example here, this is another screen cap from Etherscan. There are a number of, so one of the most popular smart contract on Ethereum seems to have, roughly 26% of the overall extant supply of Ether in it. And, it's the Beacon deposit contract, which I believe has purposes of staking, right? If you look, there's transaction to it, roughly every minute in a 32 ETH minimum, which is the staking minimum. There's some other ones, Robinhood has a notable address here, Binance, Arbitrum, etc. So, you can get a sense of popularity from digging through addresses that have lots of transactions associated with them. And those tend to be human identifiable. I think at a certain point, it's hard to keep that activity kind of anonymous, if you will. And so as you can see, there are these tags associated with these addresses. So when might you want anonymity, pseudonymity, et cetera? Some people just merely have a privacy preference. I think this has changed with the generations a little bit, but that it's, the tradition, assumptions of, say, traditional banking are kind of around privacy, right? So transactions are bilateral. They're known to the banks involved in those transactions, but, not to the whole world, right? You don't want people's balances leaking. If you're a crypto whale, you probably really don't want people to know how much you have and what they might target, et cetera. So beyond preference, there might be a safety concern at certain dollar values, et cetera. And also, we've seen plenty of cases in the blockchain world where people start a new project. They never reveal any kind of real world identity. They create sort of an avatar, if you will, and take funds in, and maybe nothing ever happens after that, but they keep the funds, right? So there's a variety. There's definitely a non-nefarious case for privacy, but also it's a mixed bag. Similarly, you might not want anonymity or pseudonymity. So as a business, right, a lot of businesses kind of sort of referral driven. You might want people to know that you're doing a lot of business so that you get more business. And just to build up, reputation over time. Or an article a little while ago also about chargebacks, how they might be implemented in the blockchain world, but that's an extremely common consumer expectation, right? So if you buy something with a credit card, maybe it's, hardware, so you get a new iPhone, you open it up, it doesn't work. Probably Apple just takes it right back. And if they don't, probably your credit card company will stop pay, and you would enter a sort of an adjudication process whereby you'd get some outcome. Most likely you get the money back. Maybe the vendor's insisting they did deliver on the service, and then, it goes to, I think, like a mini court, if you will. But in any case, it's the expectation that if the service is not delivered, you can get the funds back. And blockchain transactions are sort of typically irreversible. There are means where you can implement an adjudication process on chain. But in any case, this is a good reason. So to get people to do more business with you, you want them to kind of trust the brand. So you might want to have a non-anonymous address. For accessing blockchains through kind of regulated or sort of traditional financial gateways, so think like an exchange like Coinbase, et cetera, that tends to be a KYC requirement. And so your identity is at least known to Coinbase, for instance. And so you're not completely anonymous, pseudonymous if you're using them. And some people, hardcore people, don't like that at all. Some people like entrusting a service provider for the convenience. Okay, so going back to the kind of the first point, on the other side of the chargeback example, or in all of these cases where there are kind of these large bankruptcies going on, and it wouldn't be necessarily obvious who the claim holders are. If that KYC isn't done, you would sort of have to proactively prove that you kind of transferred value from a given address to someone who made a promise and then they didn't follow through on that promise. You would want possibly ahead of time to have registered that you are on the other side, so you could have recourse to the normal legal systems and all that sort of thing. And what we're seeing in the last year, 2 years, 3 years, and before is that traditional law enforcement, the courts, all that sort of thing, still seem to be needed, right? Like the systems are not perfect enough yet to prevent all fraud, unhappy consumers, et cetera. And so, fraud is still fraud, if the seller, let's say, is committing it on chain and trying not to reveal their identity. And so you might actually want to sort of pre-register so that the traditional authorities can represent your interests. You also might not want to do that. Depends on your philosophy, but that's a reason to not have a pseudonymous address as a buyer, so to speak. So there's some solutions out there, between kind of partial and complete, in my opinion. So Namecoin was the first altcoin, which was it's basically a variant of Bitcoin. Technically speaking, I believe it's merge mined with Bitcoin, which I'm not going to define at this time. So it's kind of its own blockchain. It's kind of not its own blockchain. And it kind of aimed at creating a decentralized version of DNS, which is the domain service, which you use all the time. So how do you know that Google is Google, right? It's a registered domain, and there's sort of various authorities that check that they are who they say they are. It's kind of similar even to like a property titling system. Namecoin sort of has so you can make a transaction and associate data with that transaction. And it's kind of in like a first to file concept. So you could say something like, hey, I'm Kieran and my address is, the Empire State Building, right? And so you could assert then that if you're, paying Kieran, you know where to do it, so to speak. Very simplified and not quite accurate example. But the idea being that blockchains, yes, the output are, Bitcoins, Ether, all that sort of thing, but there's data as well that you can have a sort of secure title to, claim on, whatever you want to call it, that allows you to associate your human identity with your on-chain actions. And then I'd say so Namecoin seems still like a science project. It's big technical leap forward, great idea. I don't think they've focused really hard on adoption, I think. So it appears to have been, partially forgotten, I guess. ENS, pretty similar. It's implemented on Ethereum, not on its own blockchain, I believe via smart contracts and other means. I haven't looked deeply into the back end. But if you see these sort of, Vitalik.eth domain names, those use ENS. And it's kind of similar. They're sort of, you're trying to, first to file your name. So there was maybe a bit of a rush on ENS names at some point. I assume they're transferable. So if you grabbed yours, just like with regular domains, domain squatting was a big thing in the early days of the internet. Supposedly some people did quite well by buying up, let's say, names of major corporations in the .com and then selling them off to those corporations. So in any case, domain registration happens, and then you can use that in on a number of different systems. So it's I think rooted in the blockchain, but they show up on social media and all that sort of thing. It's much more popular than Namecoin. There are also, so you might embed something human readable in the address itself. And the technical means to do that is basically, so what's an address really? Address is more or less a public key associated with a private key. What the private key lets you do is assign messages from yourself. And what the public key does is let people know who those messages are from and can be sent to. So when you pay someone, more or less you're paying to their public key. It's actually an address, which I believe is a shortening of the public key. It's been a long time since I coded up, but I believe it's the only reason is to make them shorter and store less data on the blockchain. So when I'm paying someone, it's like paying, quite literally to their address in a sense. And the kind of uniqueness of addresses is not enforced per se, but it's a consequence of how they're generated. So basically, you take private key, you generate the public key, which you can shorten to the address. And you should essentially never be able to generate the same address twice, so long as your private key is sufficiently random, right? What you can do, though, is pick the address so that part of it is human readable. Basically, because the output is random, sometimes you would get a word, very rarely you could get a word like, wheelbarrow or something like that. Wheelbarrow is very long, and so it would take a long time to generate an address with wheelbarrow. But I'll show very quickly an example. I did it already, but I'll do it again with my initials. This is a tool called Vanity BTC. Says it's open source, etc. This is not an endorsement of Vanity BTC. This is just what you get when you Google Bitcoin vanity address. So let's say I wanted to generate an address with my initials. It's only 3 letters, so it's pretty quick, actually. And so basically what this is doing is generating lots of private keys. I'll start it. And it found one very quickly. And correspondingly generating the public key and address associated with that. So this is the address, and you see it starts with 1 KJL. Don't use this private key. I wouldn't rely on a web-based service to generate private keys. Of course, it says, it can't capture the private key, and it probably cannot. But, be really careful when you do this sort of stuff. This is just an informational example. I generated so it gets slower already. So I use the word food here. Maybe I'll do that again. This one took a little bit longer. So let's say I'll generate it. You see, so when it's estimating this probability, it's running through thousands of addresses and checking that the address characters match that of the word here. So it did, in fact, find one. And it had to search through, about 150,000, it looks like. Or sorry, is that right? No, that looks shorter. No, that's right. Yeah, about 150,000 to actually get one. So all this is to say is that you can make the addresses themselves kind of human readable. So if Binance Corporation or Coinbase wanted to put Coinbase at the front of their address, they could generate one. It might take a little while. The longer the name, it gets exponentially longer to generate a vanity address. But this was sort of a early attempt at the problem that I think is still somewhat popular today, though it may have been subsumed, at least in the Ethereum world, by smart contract-based approaches. So you would know who to pay to some extent because my initials are KJL. Now, another thing that I've heard is that some people will only check the first couple letters of an address. And so scammers know this, so they'll make vanity addresses assert that they are the real party behind the address, and it matches for the first 5 or 6 alphanumeric characters, and it doesn't match for the rest. So it's another thing to be careful of. So just to wrap up, kind of what's missing in this question. So the UX is still not great. I think I've just observed people when they're doing peer-to-peer payments, something like a Venmo, a Zelle seems to be the preference. And it's just because, you've already got people's phone numbers or what have you. You just kind of type that in and you can send them, US dollars, right? And it's theoretically instant. Um, Blockchains are often close to instant, but it doesn't have this really easy human tie-in, or typically does not. And so it's just not as smooth just yet as a Venmo, Zelle, et cetera. For the hardcore philosopher amongst us, the obviously Venmo, Zelle are not decentralized solutions, but I think there's something to be learned from, just their popularity and the ease of use. Ultimately, I think for blockchain crypto to win, it has to match there, exceed that, or have some other great advantage. I don't see in people I know a lot of like just casual peer-to-peer payments. It's more purpose driven for some reason or another if they go to the extra effort to use crypto in transactions. Security, still an issue, right? Like it's always a slightly disconcerting experience to do a crypto payment and hope that things work out on the other side. People always do or should often do small test payments to just see that things show up on the other end, et cetera, et cetera. Another challenge is that having immutable addresses is somewhat at odds with transactional privacy at the moment. It's less of a big deal for business, so it might be okay for the customer identity not to be known, but the business identity to be known, because again, they're trying to establish reputation a lot of the time. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword here where you really want to know who you're dealing with, but you don't want the public to know that you're dealing with them necessarily. So more on this in the future, but I would say that this story is one of the big kind of unfinished adoption questions in the blockchain space, and it'll need both kind of just front end level advances and some of back end level new crypto technology to really get smooth. So thanks everybody. Hope this was informative, and let me know if you want to learn any more on on this topic or any related topics.